I'll never forget the day my dad showed up at my door. It was a Tuesday, I think. Doesn't really matter, though. I was just finishing up my shift at the restaurant, exhausted and ready to crash. I'd been standing over the stove for hours. The smell of grease and onions stuck to me, and I could already feel the weight of the day on my shoulders. I was locking the door behind me when I heard a knock. At first, I figured it was just someone from the building, maybe a neighbor or a delivery guy. But when I opened the door, there he was, my dad, standing there holding a bunch of kids' toys. You know, the kind that light up and make noise. The kind you'd get for a birthday or Christmas. I stared at him for a second, completely thrown off. What was he doing here? And why the toys? He wasn't the kind of guy who showed up with gifts, especially not for me. We hadn't exactly been close, not in a long time. Hey, kiddo, he said with a smile, like everything was fine. But there was something off in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. Hi, Dad. What's with the toys? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though I was starting to get nervous. I got these for your kids, he replied, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. I blinked. Kids? He didn't even know I had kids. Hell, I wasn't married. I didn't have a husband or anything. The last time he'd seen me, I was still living in a tiny apartment, barely making ends meet. What was he talking about? I don't have kids, Dad, I said slowly, hoping I wasn't misunderstanding. He frowned, looking at me like I had just said something completely foreign. Yeah, you do. I'm pretty sure you do. You're married, right? I didn't know what to say. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, but I couldn't. Something wasn't right. This wasn't the dad I knew, the one who barely called, the one who always seemed distant. No, this was different. He seemed confused, more than usual. And maybe a little angry, too. Dad, you're not making any sense, I said, stepping back, trying to get him to leave before things got weirder. But he didn't move. I know what I'm talking about, he snapped, his face hardening. Why are you lying to me? Where's your husband? Where are the kids? His voice was rising, and it felt like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't control. I could feel my heart pounding, the worry creeping up my chest. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew it wasn't good. Dad, I said, my voice shaking now, please just go home. Let's talk when you're feeling better, okay? I could see the frustration in his face, but instead of calming down, he got more upset. I don't need this. I'm not crazy. He turned sharply and stomped off, the toys still clutched in his hands like they were the only thing holding him together. I stood there in the doorway, my mind racing. What just happened? Was he drunk? Sick? Had I missed something? I tried calling him, but no answer. I called my brother, too. No response there either. So I did what I always did when I didn't know what to do. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that maybe he just had a bad day. But deep down, something told me it was more than that, and that's when the worry really set in. I didn't know what was going on with my dad, but I knew it wasn't just some weird moment. Something was wrong, and I needed to figure it out before it got worse. I spent the next few hours in a daze trying to make sense of what had just happened. I couldn't shake the image of my dad standing there, holding those toys like everything was normal. It was all so strange. And I kept going over it in my head, wondering if I'd missed something. If I'd missed him somehow. Maybe I wasn't paying enough attention. I tried calling him again. Nothing. I tried calling my brother, but he didn't pick up either. I figured maybe he was at work or just ignoring his phone. He had a way of doing that when he didn't want to deal with stuff. But after a while, I started to get more and more uneasy. That feeling in my gut kept nagging at me. I didn't know what else to do, so I called my uncle. He was the one who'd always tried to help when things went south with Dad. He picked up after the second ring. Hey, Uncle Mike, I said, trying to sound casual, but I knew my voice was tight. Have you talked to Dad today? There was a long pause. No, why? What's going on? I don't know, I said, my words coming out in a rush. He just came by my place, acting strange. He's not making any sense. I'm really worried about him. Hold on, he said, his voice suddenly serious. I'll call you right back. I hung up, staring at the phone in my hand, anxiety creeping up my spine. Something was definitely wrong with Dad, but I wasn't sure if he even knew it. A few minutes later, Uncle Mike called me back. I'm at the hospital, he said, and I felt my stomach drop. Your dad's here. He's in bad shape. What do you mean? I asked, my heart racing. He was disoriented when I found him. Uncle Mike continued, sounding exhausted. I had to bring him in. They're saying it's a severe concussion, possible brain damage. They think he mixed up his memories like he was living in someone else's life for a while. I couldn't breathe. Brain damage? I repeated, almost in disbelief. What happened? Uncle Mike paused, clearly struggling to find the words. He fell a few days ago. Hit his head pretty hard, but he didn't tell me. I just thought he was acting off, but I didn't realize how bad it was. I gave him some painkillers, but I didn't take him to the hospital right away. I thought he'd be fine. My stomach twisted. My uncle had known something was wrong, but instead of getting help, he'd made things worse. I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me, but there wasn't any room for that now. Not when Dad was in the hospital, not when I still didn't know what would happen to him. I could hear Uncle Mike's voice crack over the phone. I messed up, kid. I should have done more. I'm sorry. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him how careless he was, how he could have prevented this, but I didn't. I couldn't. I had no energy left for that. What now? I asked quietly, my throat tight. They're running some tests. I'll let you know what they say, Uncle Mike replied. But you should come here, okay? He's asking for you. I felt my hands shake. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to see him like this. But I knew I had to. For him. I'll be there soon, I said, hanging up the phone. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady myself. I didn't know what to feel. My heart was heavy, and my mind was racing. The Dad I remembered was gone. This was someone else. Someone I didn't know, and I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to fix him, but I had to try. The drive to the hospital felt like it took forever. I couldn't stop thinking about what Uncle Mike had told me. My dad, lying in a hospital bed, confused and broken. I couldn't wrap my head around it. I wanted to stay angry at my uncle for not acting sooner, but the truth was I was scared. Scared of what was happening to my dad. Scared of what was happening to our family. When I walked into the hospital, I wasn't sure what to expect. I wasn't sure if I'd see my dad as he was, or if he'd be someone else entirely. But when I saw him lying there in that bed, hooked up to machines, I felt my heart drop. He looked small, fragile, nothing like the man I used to know. Uncle Mike was sitting in the chair next to the bed, looking completely worn out. His eyes were red, like he hadn't slept in days. Hey, I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady. How's he doing? Uncle Mike looked up at me, his face pale. They're doing what they can. They're running tests, but it's hard to say. He's been asking for you. I nodded, swallowing hard. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to run, to go back home and pretend this wasn't happening. But the other part, the part that knew I couldn't turn my back on him, kept me rooted in place. I pulled up a chair beside the bed and sat down, looking at my dad's face. He looked peaceful in some ways, like he was just taking a nap. But I knew that wasn't true. He wasn't going to wake up and go back to being the dad I remembered. This wasn't something we could just fix. Dad? I whispered, touching his hand lightly. It's me. It's your daughter. For a moment, there was no response. But then, his eyes fluttered open, and he looked straight at me. For a split second, I saw a flicker of recognition. His eyes softened, like he knew who I was. But then it was gone. He blinked again, his expression going blank. Who are you? He asked, his voice weak. Where am I? My heart broke a little. This wasn't the man who used to pick me up from school or take me out for ice cream on hot summer days. This wasn't the dad who had always known exactly who I was. This was someone lost. Someone who didn't even recognize his own daughter. "I'm your daughter," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "You're in the hospital, Dad. You had an accident." He looked at me, his brow furrowing. "Accident? What happened?" I didn't know how to answer that. How could I explain what had happened? How could I tell him that everything had changed, that he might never be the same again? The thought of it made my chest tight. "Dad, you fell," I said softly, trying to keep the details simple. "You hit your head, but the doctors are helping you now." He didn't seem to understand. He just kept looking at me, confused, like he didn't quite know what was going on. His gaze shifted around the room, like he was trying to make sense of everything, but it wasn't working. Uncle Mike stood up, clearing his throat. "We should let him rest, I think. The doctors will be back soon." I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. I didn't want to leave him alone, but I didn't know what else to do. So I stayed for a while longer, holding his hand, even though I didn't know if he knew who I was, even though I wasn't sure if he even knew where he was. As I sat there, I couldn't help but think about everything that had led up to this. How we had gotten here. My dad wasn't just some stranger in a hospital bed. He was my father. But was he still the same man? Was there any part of him left in there? And if he wasn't, what would that mean for me? For our family? I wasn't sure. But I knew I couldn't walk away now. Not after everything we had been through. Not after everything he had done for me, even if it wasn't always perfect. I stayed there for hours, watching my dad sleep and hoping, wishing, that somehow he would wake up and remember me. Remember us. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. Not in the way I hoped. The next few days passed in a blur. I spent most of my time at the hospital trying to be there for my dad while also trying to figure out what had gone wrong. The doctors did their best to explain everything, but I felt like I was lost in a sea of medical terms and bad news. Brain damage, concussion, memory loss. They kept telling me the same things over and over, like it was supposed to make it easier to understand. But it didn't. It just made everything feel more real and more impossible. I kept asking about his condition, trying to get a clear answer. But no one could tell me anything for sure. Some days he seemed better, more awake, like maybe he was starting to come around. But then other days, it was like he had no idea who I was, or where he was, or even what year it was. It was exhausting. And I didn't know how much longer I could keep doing this. One afternoon, I decided to take a break and call my brother. I hadn't heard from him in a while, and I wasn't sure if he even knew what was happening. I'd been so wrapped up in everything with Dad that I hadn't had time to reach out, but I needed to talk to someone, and he was the only one who could understand. "Hey, it's me," I said when he finally picked up the phone. "I've been meaning to call you." He sounded tired, like he hadn't been sleeping. "Yeah? What's going on?" I took a deep breath. "It's Dad. He's in the hospital. He had a bad fall, and now it's bad. The doctors aren't sure what's going to happen. He's not remembering things. He's confused all the time. It's like he's not even the same person anymore." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing, like he didn't know what to say. "You should have called me sooner," he finally said, his voice flat. "I know. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know what to say." "Well, how is he? What's going on with him?" I tried to explain as best as I could, but the words felt clumsy and too small for what we were dealing with. I told him about the brain injury, the memory loss, how he wasn't really himself anymore. But even as I said it out loud, it didn't feel real. It felt like a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. "He's still the same person in some ways," I said almost to myself. "But in other ways, it's like he's a stranger." "He doesn't even recognize me, does he?" my brother asked, his voice tinged with bitterness. I hesitated. "No, he doesn't." I could hear the hurt in his voice even though he was trying to hide it. "Great. Just great." The conversation wasn't going well, and I could feel the walls between us growing higher. I wanted to reach out to him, to ask for help, but I knew he wouldn't be able to give me what I needed. We hadn't talked much since everything fell apart between us, and now, with Dad's condition getting worse, it felt like we were both lost in our own separate worlds. "Look, I'll come by when I can," he said, his tone colder now. "But don't expect me to do anything else. I've got my own life to deal with." I didn't know how to respond to that. I wanted to argue, to tell him that this wasn't just about Dad. It was about us, too. But I didn't have the energy for a fight. Not now. Not when everything else was falling apart. I ended the call and sat there for a long time, staring at the screen of my phone. I felt alone. I felt like I was carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders, and no one else even noticed. I knew my brother had his own pain, his own anger, but it didn't make it easier. I needed him, but he wasn't here. And now I didn't even know if he would be. After the call, I went back to the hospital. I sat beside Dad's bed again, watching him sleep, wondering if he even knew I was there. Some days, he was quiet. Other days, he would ask the same questions over and over, like his brain couldn't hold on to anything for long. Where am I? What happened to me? Why don't I remember? It broke my heart every single time. I kept hoping he would snap out of it, that he would remember something, anything that could bring him back to me. But it wasn't happening, and I was starting to wonder if it ever would. As the days dragged on, I kept asking myself if I was doing enough. Was I doing enough for him? Was I doing enough for our family? It didn't feel like it. But I didn't know what more I could do. All I could do was sit there, holding his hand, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he would remember me. But in the end, I knew I couldn't force him to come back. I couldn't force things to be the way they used to be. And that thought, more than anything, was the hardest pill to swallow. It's strange, you know? How quickly everything can change. One minute I was just trying to get through the day, working, living my life, dealing with the usual stuff. And the next minute, my world was upside down. I didn't realize how much I'd been taking for granted until I was sitting there in the hospital, watching my dad struggle to remember who I was. Watching him slowly slip away from me. But that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was the guilt. The constant, gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach that maybe I could have done something sooner. Maybe I could have been there more. Maybe I could have noticed the signs that he was struggling before it all got this bad. I couldn't stop thinking about the things I never said, the conversations I avoided, the moments I chose not to share, thinking there'd always be time. Now I was stuck with this feeling like I was failing him, like I wasn't doing enough to fix it, and I hated myself for it. I remember one day, sitting next to Dad in the hospital, staring at him while he slept. The steady beep of the machines was the only sound in the room. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to change, something to shift. But nothing happened. Dad just lay there, so still, so quiet. And it was like time had stopped. I wanted to scream at the universe, to demand why this was happening to us. Why had everything gone so wrong? Why couldn't I just fix it? I had no answers. All I had were questions that no one seemed to have the answers to. It was then that I thought about how we got here, about how things used to be. It wasn't always like this. I remember when Dad was, well, Dad, before everything got so complicated, before everything fell apart. I thought back to the years before the recession hit, back when Dad seemed invincible, when he had a good job, a strong presence in the house. He was the kind of dad who would sit with me on the porch, talking about life, telling me stories about his youth. We didn't always get along, but there was a kind of unspoken bond between us. I could count on him, and I think deep down, he knew he could count on me too. But after the recession, everything changed. The arguments, the tension, the stress of money problems, it all wore him down, and it wore me down too. My parents' relationship crumbled, and I watched as Dad withdrew from everything. I couldn't help him. I couldn't fix what was broken between them, and I didn't know how to handle his anger or his disappointment. But I never thought it would lead to this. I never thought I'd be sitting here in the hospital, watching him fight to remember who he was, wondering if he ever would again. A part of me wanted to reach out to my brother, to ask for help, to ask for someone to help me carry this weight. But things had been so broken between us for so long. Our relationship, just like everything else in our family, had been strained, worn thin by years of misunderstandings and resentments. I knew he wouldn't be able to give me what I needed. He wasn't ready. And maybe I wasn't either. I was still angry at him, still hurt by the way he had pulled away when Dad needed him most. But I also knew that deep down he was struggling too. He was dealing with his own pain, his own feelings of abandonment. He didn't know how to handle this any better than I did. And that realization, it didn't make it easier, but it made it a little more bearable. It made me feel like maybe, just maybe, I wasn't entirely alone in this. But even with that, even with the understanding, the weight of everything was still crushing. Every day, I woke up and went through the motions, trying to be strong for my dad, trying to be strong for the family, but I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep going like this. Every day felt like I was carrying a boulder, just one more step forward, always looking for a way to lighten the load. And then there was the nagging thought that maybe I wasn't doing enough, maybe I wasn't enough for Dad, maybe I hadn't been there when he needed me most. Maybe I was too wrapped up in my own life, too distracted to see the signs. Maybe if I had paid more attention, maybe if I had been more present, things would have turned out differently. But that's the thing with regret, isn't it? You can't change the past. You can only live with it. But I had to find a way to let go of that guilt, or it was going to eat me alive. I had to find a way to forgive myself for the things I couldn't control. Because if I didn't, it would swallow me whole. And that wasn't going to help anyone. It wouldn't help Dad. It wouldn't help me. And it certainly wouldn't help the family. So, as I sat there day after day next to Dad's bed, I tried to remind myself that I was doing the best I could. Even if it didn't feel like it. Even if it didn't seem enough. I had to believe that it was. Because if I didn't, what was the point of any of it? I don't know how many days had passed since I last had a real conversation with Dad. It felt like time was stretching out in weird ways. Some hours seemed to drag on forever, and others slipped by without me even realizing. I was stuck in this strange, endless cycle of sitting by his bedside, watching him sleep, listening to the beeping machines, and hoping for some sign that he would wake up, that he would come back to us. But then one afternoon, something shifted. It wasn't anything dramatic, nothing that felt like a breakthrough. It was just a small moment, almost unnoticed at first, but when it happened, it felt like a crack in the wall of all the chaos. I had just gotten there, like I did every day. I sat down in the chair next to Dad's bed, my usual spot. His eyes were closed, his face pale and still. I was used to the silence, but today, for some reason, it felt louder than usual. The hum of the machines, the soft shuffle of footsteps outside the room, it all felt too much. I felt like I couldn't breathe. And then, without any warning, Dad's hand twitched. Just a little, but it was enough to make me jump. I looked down at his hand, my heart pounding in my chest. Was he waking up? Was he trying to move? I couldn't tell, but I held my breath and waited, hoping for something, anything, that meant he was coming back. Then, a few seconds later, his eyes fluttered open. For a moment, I wasn't sure if he was really seeing me or if it was just the disorientation from the concussion. His eyes were unfocused, distant, but then, slowly, they sharpened. He looked at me for a long time, as if trying to place me, like he was reaching through the fog in his brain to figure out who I was. And then he spoke. "You're here," he said, his voice hoarse, like he hadn't used it in a while. "Where's everyone else?" I almost couldn't believe it. For a moment, I just sat there, frozen, unable to respond. My heart was racing, but I managed to say, "It's just me, Dad. It's just you and me." He blinked, like he was trying to understand what I was saying. "You're okay?" he asked, his voice full of confusion, like he wasn't sure if I was really here or if it was some kind of dream. I'm okay, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to let the tears slip out. I'm here, and you're going to be okay too. I didn't know if that was true. I didn't know if he was going to be okay. But I had to tell him something. I had to give him hope. We sat there for a few more minutes, the silence hanging between us, but it didn't feel as heavy. It felt like, in that moment, we had some kind of connection again. Like he was still there, underneath all the confusion and pain. Maybe, just maybe, we weren't completely lost yet. After a while, Dad drifted back to sleep. His breathing slowed and his hand relaxed in mine. I sat there for a long time after that, not wanting to move. Not wanting to break the fragile peace we had found, even if it was just for a moment. I thought about what he had said. "Where's everyone else?" he had asked. It hit me then, how much we had all drifted apart. How much we had all been running. From each other, from the mess of everything that had happened. Maybe it was easier to ignore the problems, to pretend that things were fine, but we all knew deep down that we couldn't keep running forever. I didn't know how to fix everything. I didn't know if I could fix everything. But in that moment, sitting by my dad's side, I realized something important. Maybe it wasn't about fixing everything all at once. Maybe it was about taking it one step at a time, one day at a time, just being there, just showing up. Maybe that's what he needed from me now. Not answers, not solutions, just someone who was there, someone who wouldn't leave. As I sat in the quiet room, watching him sleep, I made a promise to myself. I wasn't going to let go of him. I wasn't going to give up on him, no matter how hard it got. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I had to be strong enough to face. It made to face whatever came next, for him, for me, for us. The days after that small moment with Dad felt different. It wasn't like everything magically got better, but somehow, I felt like I had a little more strength to keep going. Maybe it was because I had seen a spark of something in him, a sign that he was still there, even if it was buried beneath the confusion and the pain. Maybe it was because, for the first time in a while, I wasn't just waiting for him to get better. I was accepting the reality of where we were and what was happening. Dad was still in the hospital, still recovering, but it felt like we had entered a new phase. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but no one was making any promises. I knew better than to get my hopes up too high. But something inside me told me that even if things didn't go back to the way they were, we could still find a way to make it through. I started showing up at the hospital every day, not just as the daughter, who was there out of obligation, but as someone who was really trying to make a difference. It wasn't always easy, and there were days when I felt like I was drowning in everything. But when I walked into that room, I did it for him. I did it because I didn't want him to feel like he was alone, like everyone had given up on him. It wasn't just about his physical recovery anymore. It was about the emotional weight, the burden of everything that had happened between us, and how we could move forward from here. One day, as I sat there with him, I finally made the decision. I was going to stop holding on to the anger. I was going to stop blaming myself for the past. I wasn't going to forget everything, but I was going to learn to forgive. Forgiving Dad, forgiving myself, it was the only way to move forward. Because if I didn't, we'd just stay stuck. And I couldn't live like that anymore. It wasn't easy. There were still days when I felt that old anger creeping up, when I wanted to scream at him for everything that had happened. But I knew, deep down, that holding on to that resentment wasn't helping either of us. It was just making the pain worse. And then there was the question of my brother. I hadn't spoken to him in what felt like forever, not really. After everything had fallen apart, after Dad had moved away, things between us had been tense. We didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to fix it, but I knew I had to try. I made the call one evening, not sure if he'd even answer. It had been so long since we had a real conversation, and I wasn't sure where to begin. But when he picked up the phone, it felt like a weight lifted off my chest. I didn't know what to say at first. I had all these things I wanted to get off my chest, but it wasn't the time for that. It wasn't the time for blaming or fighting. It was time to try and rebuild. "How's Dad?" he asked, his voice soft, hesitant. I could tell he wasn't sure what to say either. He's still here, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. He's still fighting. There was a pause. Then finally he spoke again. I'm sorry for everything, for how things went down between us. I should have been there. And that was it. In that moment, I felt like we were starting over. I didn't need to hear a grand apology. I didn't need him to fix everything. I just needed him to show up, to be willing to try. And he did. We talked for a while longer, not about anything specific, just about life, about where we were, about how things had been so messed up for so long. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't going to be, but it felt like the first step. A step toward healing, toward rebuilding, toward not letting the past define us. After I hung up the phone, I sat there for a while, letting it all sink in. It wasn't the perfect ending to everything. There were still so many questions, so much unresolved. But I had hope. For the first time in a long time, I had hope that things could get better. Not all at once, not overnight, but little by little. One day at a time. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I wasn't walking it alone anymore. And that made all the difference.